It was mid-afternoon on a Thursday, and the airport departure lounge was bustling with activity. On one side were fast food cafes and shops, and on the other were rows of escalators leading to baggage control and boarding gates. In front of the escalators there were barriers with the words, "Only for passengers further." Here people said goodbye to each other. On this special day, Becky Sanford said goodbye to her parents. Her father finally fulfilled his promise and took her mother on a 6-week tour of America. Both older, white-haired couples seemed a little puzzled that this was actually happening, as if they were about to wake up and realize it was a dream. But when Becky received a hug from her mother, the tight, extra squeeze was very real. "Thank you, dear," the elderly woman whispered, "and God bless you." Becky's throat tightened and tears welled up in her eyes. The women exchanged a nod before the older couple picked up their rolling suitcases and walked through the departure gate together. Becky stood and watched her mother and father go up the escalator, waving every time her mother turned around. Then they disappeared, heading off to the next chapter of their adventure together. Becky wiped away a tear and walked away. She was going to go straight to the parking lot, but something inside her didn't want to go back to her life so soon. Instead, Becky went to one of the clearly commercialized fast food joints, bought a latte in a paper cup, and sat down on the edge of the seating area. There was a kind of high shelf with hybrid bar stools, and sitting there, you could watch what was happening in the room. She sipped her latte and enjoyed the feeling of watching the world go by. Becky was not a religious person, but she still felt deeply moved by her mother's blessing. Yes, part of it was gratitude for Becky's role in ensuring that her father kept his promise. But more than that, it meant the end of the silent conflict between mother and daughter. The final nod and look in her mother's eyes told Becky, "We are okay, my dear daughter. We are fine." The source of the conflict was Becky's decision, along with husband Brian, to renew their marriage vows earlier this year without inviting family and friends. Even the two witnesses required by law were employees of the church administration. The couple decided to keep it a secret, but when Becky asked her mother and father to look after Tara for a couple of days, her mother wanted to know why and didn't believe the romantic elopement story. She knew her daughter too well. So Becky told her mother, and her mother was deeply upset. She firmly believed that marriage vows should be said in front of family and loved ones, and made a compelling case that Tara especially should have been there to witness it. Becky countered that she and Brian had already said their original marriage vows in public once before, and this time they wanted to do it privately. "This is between me and Brian," Becky said. "This is a personal commitment." Becky's mother looked at her daughter. She opened her mouth and said quietly, "Did Brian do something, my dear?" "No, Mom." "Then did you do something?" Becky swallowed, but somehow her eyes remained dry. Her memory flashed back to Marcus DeVere, the man with whom she had almost cheated on Brian. In fact, the man she would have cheated on Brian with if it weren't for his presence, although Becky didn't want to admit it, even to herself. Instead, she looked her mother straight in the eyes and said, "This is between me and Brian." It was her final word, and she would cut her mother out of her life rather than reveal anything more. So the mother stopped talking and agreed to look after Tara for the 2 days Becky needed. As I said, the old woman knew her daughter, but she did it reluctantly, and after that a certain coolness hung between the two women. But as she sipped her premium latte, which was definitely not premium, Becky realized that the cold had thawed, and it was now spring. The mother let go of her resentment that her daughter had secrets she wanted to keep, and that was a big accomplishment for Becky's mother. Becky appreciated the older woman for being able to let it go, and she made a promise to herself to do the same for Tara when she grew up. It was at this moment of reflection that a woman in a raincoat walked past, rolling a burgundy suitcase on wheels. She turned her head just as Becky's gaze fell on her, and for a moment the women's eyes met. Then the woman turned away, and if she had continued walking, that would have been the end of it. But she didn't continue walking. Her head snapped back to Becky, this time with an expression of recognition and disbelief. Becky saw intelligent gray eyes, a clean jawline, and cherry red hair. A name flashed in my head. Shibin. The woman stood frozen in place, looking at Becky like a fox in a trap. Becky stood up, looking over the wooden barrier of the cafe like a homeowner looking through his garden fence. "My God, it's really you," Becky said. "But you were blonde, weren't you?" "I haven't been blonde in years," said another woman. "Understood. Sorry." Siobhan looked elegant in her coat and boots, her silk scarf the same burgundy color as her rolling suitcase. She seemed to have made up her mind and walked towards the wooden barrier. As she approached, Becky remembered how the same woman had approached her in a crowded pub. Becky had just met Brian and Siobhan was working for him at the time. This was back in the days when Brian owned a small business, before his then partner Eric made a deal with the new investors behind Brian's back and forced him out of the company. All this was a long time ago and does not matter. Although Becky wondered if that was why Siobhan was a little nervous about meeting her. Did she stay with Eric after Brian left? "Hi," Siobhan said warily. "This is Becky, right?" "Yes, faithfully." "What a coincidence." "What? Meet you here?" "Oh yes, of course. What are the odds, huh?" "Yes." Siobhan nodded and smiled awkwardly. Becky's smile was no less awkward. She was looking for something to say. "Are you still working for Eric?" "No," said Siobhan. "God, no. Half the staff left within 6 months of Brian's departure. I was one of them." "Is it true?" "Yes. It wasn't the same without Brian. He'll be glad to hear it." "What, are you still together?" The surprise in her voice was obvious, and Becky didn't like it very much. Siobhan seemed to realize that she had made a faux pas and tried to apologize. "Sorry," she said. "I didn't mean it." "What did you mean?" "Look, I was just surprised." "Why?" "Becky." "No, really, Siobhan. What's so amazing about Brian and I having a great marriage?" Becky stood straight as a stick, glaring at the other woman. The memories of that time came flooding back, not to mention the emotions that came with them. Quarrels, worries, this whole shitty situation. But she wasn't the only one with emotionally charged memories. Siobhan also straightened up and looked Becky in the eyes. When she spoke, her voice lost all trace of apology. "Because you were terrible to Brian," she said. "At his worst moment, all you did was humiliate him. You don't know what happened. I was there. Yes, stabbing Brian in the back. You were a traitor. He knew that if he started fighting, the whole company would collapse and everyone would lose their jobs. That's why he agreed to the settlement, and why you called him a loser. Every wife is angry with her husband. Not like you," Siobhan said, taking a step forward. "What wife says to her husband, 'A real man would have seen this coming,' or 'A real man would know how to protect his interests,' or how about, 'Eric's wife is lucky because at least she's not married to a weakling.'" Becky turned white, speechless from the words she had spoken more than half a dozen years ago. Words uttered to Brian in the privacy of their home. How the hell did this woman know about them? Okay, Brian obviously told her, but under what circumstances? Siobhan saw the look in Becky's eyes and seemed to enjoy it. Becky's anger gave way to a kind of stunned disbelief. She saw the hatred and contempt in the other woman's expression, and it shocked her. "How can anyone hate me?" she thought. Siobhan then walked right up to the barrier and whispered with a venomous intonation. "It sounds like a snippet from a dramatic conversation. If there's a specific context or background you'd like to explore, or if you want to create a story around this dialogue, I'd be happy to help." Becky's mouth dropped open in horror. Siobhan took a moment to savor the effect, then turned and walked away, head held high and shoulders straight. She disappeared into the crowd, and a minute later Becky saw her for the last time, going up the escalator, heading for a flight to God knows where. It was evening. Becky sat barefoot on the giant L-shaped couch, cross-legged, picking at her nail cuticles. She tried to distract herself with the phone, but some inner voice told her not to clutter her mind, and she decided to listen to it. Brian, who was currently putting Tara to bed, had a knack for using Becky's emotionality to his advantage, and she was determined not to let that happen this time. Indeed, she took a page from Brian, thinking deeply about past events, exploring her emotions about them, and understanding exactly why she was so upset. She even formulated her arguments, and came up with answers to Brian's most likely counterarguments. In other words, she intended to beat her husband at his own game. The possibility that Brian was innocent was dismissed the moment the thought crossed her mind. Siobhan would never have been so specific if it weren't true. It would be like stabbing an enemy with a stage dagger with a retractable blade. No, Becky thought. Siobhan was too smart for that. The blade was real. Becky heard her husband's footsteps on the stairs and stopped picking her nails. She turned to the spot on the couch where Brian would be sitting, took a deep breath, and let it out slowly. The door opened and her husband walked in and quietly closed the door behind him. He stood for a moment, looking at her. "Would you like a drink?" he asked. "No thanks." The politeness with which Becky spoke warned Brian of trouble, although he had felt it all evening. But it was impossible to discuss this with Tara nearby, so he kept the conversation on general topics, asking about her parents and receiving polite answers. But now they were alone, and he was really curious to know what was going on. He took his place on the edge of the sofa and turned towards her like an opponent in a duel. "Okay," he said. "What's happening?" This expression usually made Becky smile, but not today. Instead, Becky cleared her throat and spoke with businesslike calm. "I ran into someone at the airport," she said. "Someone who worked for you when you were Eric's partner." Brian's face darkened. He shifted in his chair, looked at the pillow, and began to control his breathing. Becky watched him like a cat watching a bird. She knew that despite his attempts to appear calm, if she had placed her hand on his chest, she would have felt his heart beating rapidly. Brian looked at her. "Who was that?" he asked. "I think you know who it was," Becky said. "I also think you have an idea of what she told me." "Was it her?" "Don't play with me, Brian." "Hey, you're the one keeping me guessing. Did you cheat on me with Siobhan?" The words were released from Becky's mouth with the force of a bazooka and had much the same effect. Brian was startled, his face frozen, a clear, "oh shit" look in his eyes. It was so obvious that even when he recovered, Becky could see on his face the realization of how pointless denial would be. She watched as his face went through several emotions before settling on an expression of quiet acceptance. He took a deep breath and said, "Cold. Okay, what? Okay, yes. Yes, I changed it." Becky nodded, pursing her lips. "How many times?" she asked. "Once." "Oh, really?" "Yes, Justice. Why should I believe you? I can't control what you believe." "This is not an answer. Becky, you either believe me or you don't." "And I ask, why should I believe you?" "I don't know why you should. Maybe it shouldn't. I don't know. Do you want to believe me?" "No, I want to kill you. I want to fucking kill you. I hate you. I fucking hate you." Becky was in tears, in floods of tears, screaming and crying. Brian came to hug her, and she struggled, hitting and resisting. "Stay away," she shouted. "Stay away from me." Brian raised his hands in surrender and returned to his place on the couch. Becky remained on the floor, crying her eyes out, choking on her tears. Brian sat, dry-eyed, and waited. A good 10 minutes passed before she could speak. She lifted her head as if she weighed a ton and looked at her husband on the couch. "How can you be so calm?" she asked. "I'm not calm," Brian said. "I'm just very, very sad." "Then why aren't you crying?" "I don't know. Maybe because I deserve it." "Deserved what? Lose your marriage, your family, be divorced?" "No," Becky said, standing up. "No, you can't put divorce on the table. It's up to me to decide." "Becky, listen, bastard, you cheated on me. Then he lied about it. And then he had the audacity to lead. Acting like a resentful husband about the whole situation with Marcus de Virum, knowing full well that you were as guilty as I was. In fact, you are even more to blame. I just wanted to sleep with someone else, and you actually did it. The circumstances were absolutely." "Seriously, Brian, are you going to make excuses based on circumstances?" Becky stood over her husband, hands on hips, like an avenging angel. Brian's head was lowered, his expression convincing. "No," Brian said. "Okay, I accept your point of view. So you accept that I have the right to decide what happens next." What do you mean? Just a few months ago, Brian, I stood in church and promised to love, respect, and obey you. I didn't do this because you are a man and a woman's place is to follow a man. I did this because I honestly believed that you are a better leader than me, that you have the moral strength that I lack, and therefore you should be the head of our family. Becky paused to let it sink in. Brian looked sick. Well, Becky continued, I'm sure you understand that I feel pretty stupid right now. Becky, don't you dare say, sorry, do not dare. I'll claw your eyes out if you even think about saying that. Brian looked at her, but said nothing. When Becky spoke, her voice was reserved and cautious. What I want, she said, is to decide for myself what I want. I don't know yet whether I should stay married to you or not, but I want the freedom to figure it out on my own. After what you did, I think you owe me this. What do you think, Brian? That seems fair. Fine. Becky relaxed and took a deep breath. The worst was over. She still stood over Brian, but now she looked more like an office manager than a vengeful fury. Okay, she said. From tonight until further notice, I will sleep in the guest room. Becky, I can. No, Brian. I want to sleep in the guest room. You can stay in the marital bed if it means something to you. She looked at him sternly. Brian swallowed and nodded. Becky looked down at the floor, frowning as if struggling with her thoughts. No, she said. No, what? Nothing. I am going to sleep. Don't you want to discuss this? I think we've said enough, don't we? Brian looked at his wife's bare feet. His expression was hopeless. Becky could see that he wanted love, and that gave her a small sense of triumph. Good night, she said. And she left the room and closed the door, leaving her husband alone. Becky woke up late the next morning. She lay in bed, still tired, glad to be working from home today. Brian and Tara were already on their feet. Becky heard their voices from below. Her daughter's squeaky laugh rang out, followed by her husband's good-natured voice. Tara was probably being capricious. Damn, Becky said to the ceiling. From the sound of those two voices, Becky knew she didn't want to separate Tara from her father, and not just for Tara. Becky loved watching Brian become a father. He was good at it. And when it came to raising children, he and Brian made a great team. Even in the worst of times, this part of their relationship was reliable. Unfortunately, this also ruled out divorce. Becky was still angry at Brian, angry as hell, and untangling all that anger wouldn't be easy. Divorce would be easier. Instead of unraveling the Gordian knot, you simply cut it, move on with your life, and find another man. Women do this all the time, whereas staying married requires conversation, reflection, and self-examination. Becky felt tired just thinking about it. Why can't intimate relationships just work, instead of being a job? A child's footsteps were heard on the stairs. Becky sat up in bed just as the door opened and Tara walked in. She was dressed and ready for school. Oh, said the girl. She quickly went out and closed the door. Becky was about to ask what happened when she heard, knock, knock. Becky laughed and said, enter. Tara came in and climbed onto the bed. Becky reflexively looked at the girl's feet to make sure she wasn't wearing shoes, and then hugged her daughter. Are you going to school? Becky asked. Yes, Mom, Tara said. Mom, I have a question. What is this, dear? Why are you sleeping here? I couldn't sleep last night and didn't want to wake up your father. That's why you overslept. Yes, it's clear. There was a note of doubt in Tara's voice. Becky frowned and said, what did your father tell you? Nothing, Tara said. He said to ask you. Certainly. Will you pick me up? Of course, dear. Today is Friday. I always pick you up on Friday. Cool. Tara jumped in for another hug and then headed out the door. Becky stopped her as she was closing the door. You can leave the door open, honey, Becky said, and ask Daddy to come see me before you go, okay? Fine. Tara disappeared downstairs again. With the door open, Becky clearly heard the message being delivered. Brian's response was relaxed and affirmative. It was impossible to guess that this was a man whose marriage was hanging by a thread. Becky got out of bed and put on her robe. She heard Brian coming up the stairs and went to stand in the part of the room where the bed would be between them. Her arms were tightly crossed when he entered and stood at the door. "Good morning," he said. Becky nodded, not quite trusting her voice to hit the right tone. She coughed and said, "Why did you tell our daughter that I was sleeping here?" "Well," said Brian, "while we were having breakfast, she asked why you weren't coming down." "What did you say to her?" "I told her to ask you." "Which of course included telling her you were in the guest room. Why didn't you just tell her I was resting?" "I did not know that." "For God's sake, Brian, think about it." Brian's jaw tensed. He quietly closed the door and spoke in a lowered voice. "You and I have an agreement not to put words in each other's mouths," he said. "If Tara has a question about you, she asks you. If she has a question about me, she asks me. And if the other parent is unavailable, she must wait. Brian, this is for important things. Everything you say to your child is important. Don't be righteous with me. You are in no position to claim moral superiority. I'm not trying. This is a damn lie. You love that Tara trusts you and looks at you with admiration. She still doesn't know what kind of crap you really are." Brian looked at his wife, considering what he could say in response, and deciding not to say anything. In the silence, they both heard Tara's faint voice calling from below. Brian opened the door and shouted, "What, Tara? We have to go." Brian checked the time on his phone and winced. "Damn, she's right," he said. "So go. You. Run away. You know, Becky, you may not be a gift either." "Yes, but last time I checked, I didn't sleep with any of my colleagues." She crossed her arms and gave Brian a look that said, "Try to top that, you bastard." Brian sighed heavily and left the room. After a couple of minutes, he and Tara left, leaving Becky alone in the quiet house. Becky laid out her laptop, work papers, and fully charged phone on the dining room table. She showered, got dressed, and made herself a pot of extra strong coffee, but after half an hour of activity, she realized she couldn't concentrate. Becky leaned back and pressed her fingers to her temples, wondering what to do. She could go to the office. Working among other people was always easier. But as soon as the thought crossed her mind, her body seemed to scream, "No!" Becky knew that if she went, she wouldn't be able to stop herself from telling someone what happened, and she didn't want that. She knew from experience that women tended to take her side, and while it was tempting to have a good complaining session about Brian and men in general, some inner voice warned her that there was too much at stake to use this issue as an excuse. For women's solidarity. Sitting over a cup of coffee, Becky realized that she did not have truly close friends. All the women she interacted with were either the mothers of Tara's classmates or work colleagues, people whom Becky would trust with her daughter or keeping a promise. But who could she trust with the secret thoughts of her heart? Thoughts that even Becky herself could only feel, but not articulate. People she knew would tend to judge her or Brian and try to insert their own opinions. The only person Becky trusted to actually listen to her was Brian. "God, what a fucking mess," Becky said to herself. "Are you just arguing?" said an inner voice. "Or do you ask him for help?" Becky groaned internally. Her mother always hated it when her daughter used God's name in vain. It seemed that even though she was thousands of miles away, the elderly woman never stopped having her own opinion. "Okay, I swore," Becky said mentally. "But seriously, if you have anything to say that might help, I'm all ears." "Well, I would remind you that the vow you made in that church was not made to Brian, but to God. You didn't promise Brian you'd be a better wife if he'd be a better husband. You promised God you would be a better wife, period. So if Brian cheats on me, I should still try to be a good wife." "Yes, but this is madness. Becky, Brian breaking his vow is between him and God. This has nothing to do with you. This has everything to do with me." "Really? So if Brian starts neglecting Tara, will you feel justified in neglecting her too?" "This is different." "Why is this different?" "The principles you apply to your relationship as parents are clearly working for you and Brian. Why do you think these same principles cannot be applied to your relationship as husband and wife?" "What principles are you talking about?" "Well, isn't that what you need to find out?" Becky sat, twirling her empty cup of coffee in her hands, staring into space. Her heart was racing, and she had a bad taste in her mouth. "Why are you afraid?" said an inner voice. "I don't know," Becky said to herself. "Yes, you know." "Oh, shut up. Why does this hurt you so much?" "Because I love him," Becky screamed in her head. "I love him, and I don't love him because of how he makes me feel, or because he's a great father, or because he meets my demands. I love him, and it pisses me off that I realized how much I love him only because he cheated on me. I now have the right to get a divorce without any negative consequences for me, and I don't want it. Why not? Because it's so unfair. If I cheated on Brian, he would divorce me, no questions asked. He would say something like, "I love you, Becky, but I can't live with myself as a cuckold." And that would be it. He would forgive me and divorce me. So I feel very strongly that I should do the same with him. In fact, if I don't do the same with him, I'll feel like I've betrayed myself. You know what I mean. Becky, these concerns are valid, and you absolutely need to address them. But it hurts so much, and scary. I know, my dear. I know. Mother? Becky looked up, half expecting to see her in the room. But of course, she wasn't there. All this happened in her head. Realizing that she was alone and no one could hug her, Becky burst into tears and sobbed. Brian's workplace was a huge modern building with large windows that let in a lot of natural light. On the ground floor, there was a self-service cafe area with food and drink counters on one side and a seating area on the other. Brian paid for his lunch of tuna in ciabatta and sparkling water and went to look for a free table. He had just put the tray down when his phone rang. It was Becky. Brian took a deep breath and answered the phone. "Hello," he said. "Hello, Brian? You can speak? I just started my lunch break." "Does it mean no?" "No, no, no." "Yes, yes, I can talk." "Fine." Becky's voice was quiet and matter-of-fact. There was no warmth in it, but there was also no harshness with which she usually hid her anger. Brian didn't hear any emotion at all. This worried him, and he put his free hand on the table to keep his balance. "I want to go away for the weekend," she said. "I need to be alone to think." "Okay," Brian said. "Can you take care of Tara?" "Certainly." "Fine." There was a pause. Brian cleared his throat and said, "When do you want to leave?" "Tonight," Becky said, "and I'll be back on Sunday evening. Do you want me to pick Tara up from school?" "No, I'll do it. I promised her this, and I want to keep my word. Besides," Becky fell silent. There was silence as Brian's imagination filled with the unspoken words, "Besides, this may be the last time Tara sees me as part of a complete family." He heard Becky clear her throat. "Okay, Brian," she said. "That's all I wanted to ask. Thanks for the help. Becky, I'm her father, is not. Goodbye, Brian." The phone went off. Brian knew he had seconds before he burst into tears. Leaving the tray on the table, he quickly headed to the men's room, pocketing his phone along the way. Pushing open the door, he saw one guy at the urinal, but fortunately, all the stalls were free. Brian went into the last one, near the wall, closed the latch, and sat down on the closed toilet seat. Brian learned the art of silent crying in school, a skill that almost every boy had to master. The few who did not learn spent their time in torment, being mocked and joked about. The secret is to tilt your head down and open your mouth as wide as possible. This way, the sobs came out as quiet sighs, and one could cough to drown out the loudest ones. The tears fell straight onto the floor, so they didn't leave marks on your face when you left the booth. The tears on the floor were easily wiped away with a piece of toilet paper and washed away, so no one even knew you were crying. Of course, Brian's current colleagues wouldn't have mocked him or called him a baby to his face. But still, he didn't want to talk about it, and the best way to avoid discussing a problem is for people not to even know it exists. This is how Brian kept his only affair with Siobhan a secret from his wife all these years. If Becky knew Brian had a secret, she would have asked him in 30 seconds. But Brian decided to take that incident with Siobhan to an early grave, and once he made that decision, it just faded into the background. It helped that he and Becky were heading toward divorce at the time. Becky tried to support Brian during his conflict with Eric, but the more she realized what the financial consequences would be, the more scared she became. Brian had experienced his wife's sharp tongue when she felt insecure, but he was completely unprepared for how cruel she could be when she was terrified. The way Becky met and married Brian was like the plot of a love story, and now that plot was falling apart before her eyes. Instead of finding her soulmate, Becky felt trapped in a marriage to a man who had been betrayed by a former friend and who seemed to have forgotten about his wife and future. It was a terrible time for both of them, and Becky found Brian to blame for everything that happened, blaming him for tricking her into believing he was a real man. After a particularly violent argument in which the word loser was used, Brian ran away from home on Friday night. Driving the car on autopilot, he ended up at the office, although a week ago he handed over the keys. There was a light on in one of the windows, and Brian pressed the bell button, hoping that Eric would be there alone. But it wasn't Eric. It was Siobhan. Brian had no intention of making love to her. They sat on the couch in Eric's office, the couch that used to be in his office, and Brian told her everything that was on his mind. Siobhan was a great listener and was truly shocked by how Brian's life turned out. He started crying and tried to stop, but Siobhan wouldn't let him. She hugged him and comforted him, saying how great it was that he trusted her with his feelings. Soon Brian felt her gaze, and he found himself looking into her eyes. "Don't look at me like that," he said. "Why not?" "Because it makes me want to kiss you." "Brian, I want you to kiss me. I'm dying for you to kiss me." So Brian kissed her. "Do you want to make love?" she asked. "Yes," Brian said heavily. "I have one condition." "Fine. If we do this," Siobhan said, "I don't want half measures." Shibin. "I know you love your wife, Brian, and I don't care. I want it. Honestly, I wanted this for a very long time." Brian looked at the woman. He had never cheated in a relationship, but he fantasized about it, and in his fantasies he wanted to say no, but couldn't because of the strength of his sex drive. But the reality was different. Brian could clearly see that his sex drive was not uncontrollably strong. It seemed somehow cold-blooded and undignified to him. However, the fact that Siobhan had directly told him that she wanted to make love to him, it meant a lot to Brian. He knew Siobhan. He liked Siobhan as a colleague and as a friend. She took a big risk by being so open with him, risking his rejection. And she was absolutely not the type of woman who would take off her clothes and offer herself to a loser. He was still a real man in her eyes, and her desire for him made Brian feel manly. He realized that it was not his sex drive that was strong, but his desire to say yes. And he said, and now, years later, sitting in a toilet stall, leaning against the wall, Brian thought about that moment and the 2 hours that followed. In the only phone call he made to Siobhan after that, she described it as the best 2 hours of my life. And Brian felt the same way. She was ready to meet again, but by then Becky had told Brian that she was pregnant with Tara. This news snapped Brian out of his preoccupation with Eric and made him focus on the future. Siobhan understood. She wished Brian good luck and said she had no regrets. He loved her for it. Strange. He loved her because she accepted the fact that he didn't love her. Sitting in the booth, Brian realized that he, too, had no regrets. His only real regret was getting caught. However, if you take a risk and lose, you have to pay the price. This is how the world works. Brian wondered how high that price would be. Brian flushed the toilet and left the stall. He nodded to a couple of guys while he washed his hands, then headed back to the cafe at work. The seating area was quite busy and conversations filled the air, but Brian thought he could see the table he had chosen earlier and headed there. As he approached, he saw that it was still free, but his lunch tray was gone. After making the decision to take a weekend to herself, Becky was able to focus again. She spent the rest of the day productively and picked up Tara on time. On the way home, with her daughter buckled in the back seat, Becky decided to mention her upcoming vacation. "Mom is leaving for the weekend," she said, "so you get some alone time with Dad." "Where are you driving?" asked Tara. "Do not know yet." "Why are you going?" "I just need to be alone, honey." "But why?" Becky took a deep breath. She didn't want Tara to think it had anything to do with her. She stopped the car at a pedestrian crossing where mothers and children were waiting. "Sometimes a person needs to be alone," Becky said. "For what?" "It gives you the opportunity to think." "Isn't it possible to think with other people?" "Of course, it is possible. But it's different when you're alone with your thoughts." Hard to explain. The road cleared and Becky continued driving. In the back seat, Tara's face frowned, her mind racing. "I don't like being alone," Tara said. "Of course, honey," Becky said. "I never want to be alone." Becky looked at her daughter's face in the rearview mirror. The child's expression was more determined than sad, as if she had made a decision for herself. The feeling resonated with Becky, and she wondered, was I like this when I was Tara's age? Have I made the same statements? And how did my mother react to this? Did she say something that I don't remember, but still echoes in my head? When Becky got home, she still had a few emails to answer, so Tara got 1 hour of tablet time. Two girls sat next to each other at the dining table, both typing on electronic devices. Becky then took Tara to a nearby playground, pushed her on a swing, and watched her climb around a play structure that resembled a giant beehive. When they got home, Brian's car was already in the driveway. Tara jumped for joy when Becky opened the door. "Dad!" she screamed, rushing into the house, leaving Becky alone at the door. She heard their voices in the kitchen, the same type of good-natured chatter she had heard in the morning. But unlike in the morning, Becky did not feel any warmth from these sounds. On the contrary, Becky was angry at the child's joy at the sight of his father and thought that he did not deserve the love he received. Becky walked into the kitchen and saw Brian and Tara sitting at the table. Tara had her red jacket on, and it was now hanging over the back of her chair. For some reason, this pissed Becky off, and she immediately grabbed the jacket. "I'll hang it up, okay?" she said coldly. Brian bit his lip and took his daughter's hand. Becky lowered her head like an owl and said in a sharp voice, "You'll make dinner for Tara, right?" "Of course," Brian said. "Fine. Then I'll go pack my things." Becky left the now silent room, hung up her red jacket in the hallway, and ran up the stairs. She had a suitcase on wheels in her closet, which she took out and laid out on the bed. She began opening drawers and choosing clothes. 5 minutes later, there were tops, trousers, and skirts on the bed. Becky was just wondering whether to take 2 sweaters or 3 when there was a soft knock on the door. Becky turned to see Brian with Tara in his arms. The girl's face was pressed against his shoulder, and her legs hung limply from his arm. She didn't move, but Becky heard sobs. Brian held the baby tightly and took a deep breath. "I think the 3 of us need to sit down and talk," he said. Becky's first impulse was to scream, "You created this situation, you bastard. Figure it out yourself." But the feeling passed and Becky nodded, clearing a space on the bed so they could sit. She motioned for Brian to hand Tara over to her so she could sit the baby on her lap and hug her. Brian sat down next to the mother and daughter, placing his hand on the bed and crossing his legs. "Are you sad, dear?" Becky asked her daughter. Tara nodded, sobbing. "Why are you sad?" Becky asked. "Because you are leaving. I'll only be leaving for a couple of days. I'll be back on Sunday, I promise." "But why?" "I told you, honey. I need to think about something." "What exactly?" "Grown stuff. Things that would be unfair to burden you with." "What is burden?" Becky adjusted the baby in her lap as she thought about it. Brian watched silently with a neutral expression. "A burden is something heavy," Becky said to Tara. "You know how when we go to the supermarket, we buy groceries and then take them to the car in bags?" "Yes," said Tara. "Well, imagine that I took one of these heavy bags and said that you will have to carry it. Will this be fair?" "No." "Why not?" "Because I'm still little." "Exactly. Therefore, since I want to be fair, I will never give you a burden that is too heavy for you. You understand?" Tara frowned as she thought about it. She looked so cute that Becky had to resist the temptation to squeeze her and kiss her plump cheeks. But Mommy, Tara said, does this mean that you carrying a heavy bag? Yes, in a way, Becky said. An adult problem can feel like a heavy bag. Can't Dad help you carry it? Not this time, dear. Some bags you can carry with other people, while others you can carry alone. The bag I carry is exactly like this. Can't you put this down? I'm thinking about it, honey. Becky hugged Tara tightly and rested her chin on the baby's head. This way, Becky could look at Brian without their child seeing it. I'm thinking about putting the bag down, Becky said. But tell me, Tara, what will happen to the shopping bag if I leave it on the street and leave? Someone else can take it. It's right, and I would lose my purchases. So the question I have to ask myself is, do I want to keep the bag, or do I want to put it down? Because you see, my dear, some bags are worth carrying even if they are heavy, but other bags don't. Becky lifted her chin from the child's head and looked into her eyes. That's what I need to find out, Becky said, and it is very important that I understand everything correctly. That's why I need a couple of days to really think about it. You understand? Yes, Mommy. And I'm really sorry that I can't tell you what it is. It's not because I don't trust you, my dear, because there are adult things that are unfair to put on a child. You understand? Yes, Mommy. I love you, Mommy. I love you too, my dear girl. Becky hugged Tara and cried. But it was a cry born of happiness, so Tara herself did not cry. She simply basked in her mother's love, hugging her back and feeling safe. Brian watched as the two women in his life held each other. He then crossed his legs and quietly left the room. The Coach and Horses Inn was built in a time when men wore top hats and women wore petticoats. The horse yard has now become a guest parking lot, and you booked a place online rather than writing your name in a large leather-bound book. Still, as Becky locked the car and walked toward the side porch, she felt a little like a Dickens traveler. She even carried a suitcase on wheels by the handle, since the crunching of the wheels seemed inappropriate to the atmosphere and irritated her. Inside, the old door was all dark wood, with huge beams on the ceiling that you could reach and touch. The floor, narrow staircase, reception desk, and its paneled wall are made from centuries-old oak or cherry wood. The room was also paneled, and the walls were whitewashed stone and plaster. Becky loved it. The noise of a busy bar could be heard coming from the other end of the building, and it somehow made Becky feel welcome and expectant. She walked up to the tall reception desk, which had one of the old-fashioned hotel bells on it. Behind him stood a desk and a modern swivel chair with a jacket from a two-piece suit hanging on the back. With a computer monitor, keyboard, and cordless phone in its holder, it was a corner of modern objects inside the historical, like a museum in reverse. Becky pressed the bell on the table. Ping, ping. The door opened and a well-dressed young man entered. So, Becky thought, the jacket on the chair was from a three-piece suit. The vest looked graceful on the man's elegant figure. His white shirt was immaculate, and his tie was perfectly tied in a Windsor knot. And yet, despite his broad shoulders and muscular neck, there was a boyish air to the light curls above his ears and the way he smiled. "Good evening," he said, approaching the table. "You look good. Thank you. Have you traveled far to get here?" "About a 2-hour drive." "Fine. Will the kitchen close in 10 minutes if you're hungry?" "No, no. I had dinner before leaving." "Very wise. Well, let's check you out." The well-dressed man turned on his computer and started clicking away. Becky realized she was looking at him and turned to frown at the framed print on the wall. "So," said the man, "Rebecca Robinson, checked in for a 2-night stay with breakfast. I see that you have paid in advance, thank you. Checkout time is 10 o'clock on Sunday morning. Everything is fine." "Certainly. We can look after any luggage if you want to spend the day in the area." "Thank you, but I have a car. Everything is fine." "Everything is fine. I need to see some form of identification."
Oh,
Becky wanted to hit herself. The man looked puzzled. "Your driver's license will do," he said. "That's not the point," Becky said. "It's just..." All my documents are in my name through marriage. I understand. He frowned at the computer screen. Becky panicked and said, I'm not here to do anything. You know. Madam, I just need to confirm your identity, that's all. The reasons for your stay are entirely your own business. Becky nodded in response and pulled a small wallet from her coat pocket. Her hands were shaking, and she had difficulty getting her license. When she tried to grab the smooth plastic, the nail of her index finger bent back. Oh, she exclaimed. Madam, I'm sorry. Becky burst into tears. She stood in this beautiful room, her hair was out of her bun, and she was crying like a child. This horrified her. She was fine all that evening. She had dinner at home and put Tara to bed. She even called Brian from the car and listened, with dry eyes fixed on the road, as he told her about the night he cheated on her. There was nothing in his story that surprised her, and afterward she felt strangely indifferent, as if it had happened to a fictional television couple. Deep down, Becky already believed that men were programmed to have sex whenever they got the chance, and Brian simply confirmed that he was just like everyone else. And yet here she was now, overcome by a wave of emotion that seemed to come out of nowhere. Becky was vaguely aware of a man's hands, firm but gentle, leading her to another room, seating on the leather sofa, which creaked when she sat down, and calling for someone. I'm so sorry, Becky said through sobs. It's okay, the man said. Please take your time. Becky realized that she was sitting in some kind of living room. There was a fireplace and windows with closed curtains. One of the two doors opened, and a woman entered carrying a glass of water. She was around Becky's age and was dressed smartly in a vest and matching skirt. Here you go, said the woman. Thank you, Becky replied. She took the glass and took a sip of water. The man and woman exchanged glances. Has this lady checked in yet? The woman asked. Not really, the man answered. She still needs a key card. Why don't I do it right now? Thank you, Katie. The woman left the room. The man sat down next to Becky, resting his elbows on his knees. Becky drank the rest of her water and leaned forward, staring at the wall. Sorry about that, she said. It's okay, the man answered. We all need a good cry sometimes. Yes, but not when checking into a hotel. Ah, but this is not a hotel. No, you are in an inn. The man smiled. Try saying that after a couple of drinks. They exchanged glances. Becky felt relieved and wondered what it would be like to kiss this man. He smiled back and looked into her eyes a little longer than was strictly professional. Well, he said, Katie will be back soon. He patted his leg as he prepared to stand up. Becky suddenly wanted him to stay sitting next to her and said the first thing that came to her mind. Yesterday, I found out that my husband cheated on me. The man froze in place. I'm very sorry to hear that, he said. This happened several years ago. This doesn't make the situation any easier. No, he doesn't. The door opened and a woman named Katie walked in. She was holding a white plastic card the size of a credit card. The man stood up and Becky followed him, still holding the empty glass in her hand. You're in room 3, Katie said. I took the liberty of taking your suitcase upstairs. Thank you, Becky replied. Katie exchanged the key card for a glass. Becky held the card and looked at the man and woman. You were very kind, Becky said. You are our guest, said the man. We take care of our guests. And no, said Katie, the bar is open until 11 if you want a drink. The man turned to her and said, The room has a minibar. Yes, John, but there is a difference between sitting in a cozy bar and drinking alone in your room. For the first time, Becky felt like these two were a couple. This feeling intensified when Katie looked at her the way women sometimes look at each other. Men, right? She said. Becky was lying on the bed, fully dressed, her shoes thrown to the floor and looking up. The ceiling was whitewashed, with a large wooden beam running its entire length. This beam is probably 200 years old, Becky thought. She wondered how much sex this beam had seen in this room. Why was she thinking about sex? Because you want to take revenge on your husband. said the inner voice. Yes, Becky thought. Exactly. She started thinking about John, the man from the reception desk. She imagined him knocking on her door, entering on some pretext, and then admitting that it was just an excuse. That the real reason he came upstairs was because he couldn't stop thinking about her. That he wants to kiss her and hold her in his arms. Becky's breathing began to quicken and her body began to warm up. "Oh God," she muttered. "I take it that you are not addressing him?" asked an inner voice. "No, of course not," Becky said mentally. She was disappointed and annoyed. Who needs a suspicious mother when your own mind plays her role? "I can leave if you want," said an inner voice. "Is it true?" Becky thought in disbelief. "Certainly. You are always free to make your own decisions. I'll just answer any questions you have along the way, so you don't judge what I want. I neither approve nor condemn. I'm just giving advice." Becky lay on the bed and thought about it. She thought about Brian and Tara and her marriage. Then she thought about her attraction to John and wondered if he was really in a relationship with a woman named Katie. Things could get pretty complicated. "Okay, here's a question," Becky said to herself. "What should I do now?" "Go downstairs and have a drink," said an inner voice. "No, I mean. I know what you mean. My answer is the same. Go downstairs and have a drink." Becky frowned. She was expecting something deeper than, "Come on down and have a drink." She picked up her phone and checked the time. "Only 10 minutes left until the bar closes," she said to herself. "You asked a question, I gave you an answer," said an inner voice. "Whether you listen to him or not is your business." Becky sighed. She forced herself out of bed, opened her suitcase, and spent 5 minutes deciding whether to change her clothes. Realizing that time was running out, she put on her shoes, put her phone, wallet, and key card in a small purse, and left the room. She hurried up another set of stairs, down a corridor decorated with engravings of horses and hunting scenes, and entered a bar. There was no one in the room except the bartender, about 20 years old, who was in the process of locking the main door with a series of deadbolts and heavy metal keys. He had light brown skin and a small, fluffy afro. His parents were probably mixed race, and when he turned and saw Becky, his expression turned sympathetic. "Sorry," he said, "I'm just closing." "It's okay," Becky replied. "Are you a guest here?" "Yes." "Well, there should be a minibar in your room." "She knows about minibars," said a female voice. Becky turned around to see Katie coming in from the same hallway she had just walked down. Katie had unzipped her vest and was carrying a tablet and electronic pen. She walked past Becky and placed her things on the bar. "Come on, join me for a drink," Katie said. "Oh, Jake, bring me the schedule, please." "Of course," answered the bartender. Jake returned to the bar. Katie sat down on a bar stool and began working on her tablet. Becky still stood there, unsure if she could join. Katie spoke without taking her eyes off the tablet. "You'll be more comfortable here," she said. "Sorry." Becky walked over and sat on the bar stool next to Katie. Jake printed out a long strip of paper from the black box connected to the cash register, then tore it off and brought it back, along with a stack of papers. He turned to Becky and smiled widely. "What should I bring you?" he asked. "Oh, Diet Coke, please." "Get her a normal drink," Katie said, "at my expense." "Okay," Jake said. "What should I bring you?" "As usual for me." "Understood." Jake turned to Becky, eyebrows raised. I'll take what she got," Becky said. "Fine." Jake left to get the drinks ready. Katie was engrossed in the screen, tapping on it with her pen and occasionally checking papers. "I'll be done in a couple of minutes," she said. "Oh, don't worry about me," Becky replied. "I really appreciate it, thank you." "Well, after what John told me, I thought you needed it." Katie turned her head and looked at Becky very directly. Her eyes seemed to say, "If you have a problem with what John told me about your husband, now is the time to say something." Becky realized that despite her smart clothes and professional demeanor, Katie was tough and not afraid of confrontation. Becky felt immediate respect for the other woman and nodded to show that she was not offended. Jake appeared and placed 2 clear glasses on the bar in front of the 2 women. The drinks were clear, with ice and lemon. Becky smelled the quinine and gasped. "Oh God," she said. "Don't you like gin and tonic?" Jake asked. "No, I love you," Becky answered. "It's just, it was the drink I bought for my husband the night we met." "What a wonderful coincidence," said Jake. His wide smile disappeared when he saw Katie's expression. She signed the clipboard, collected the papers, and handed the stack to the bartender. He took it away and Katie turned and raised her glass. "What would you like to drink?" she asked. Becky thought about it. The first thing that came to her mind was to make Brian guilty. She wanted to hurt him, punish him, and really ruin his life. But the thought of saying it out loud made her feel sick. "I don't want to forgive him," she said. "This seems too weak, but I don't want to be a vindictive woman either. They always seem angry and resentful." "Who do you want to be?" asked Katie. "I want to be strong," Becky said. "But I don't really know what power looks like in this situation." "Then let's drink that." Katie raised her glass. For searching for the true meaning of power. Becky felt her heart suddenly freed from a heavy load. She picked up the gin and tonic and clinked her glass with the other woman. "For the true meaning of strength," Becky said. Brian was watching TV with his daughter on Saturday morning. After that, he made her breakfast, and they went into town to do their shopping for the week. With the car loaded with groceries, he bought her a snack at a cafe and learned more than he ever wanted to know about the Powerpuff Girls. Upon returning home, he let Tara sit in the living room and play on the tablet while he unpacked the groceries in the kitchen. Brian was halfway through putting everything away when his phone vibrated. He saw the name on the screen and his heart jumped. Swiping away the green icon, he spoke in a low voice, watching the slightly open door out of the corner of his eye. "Hello," he said. "Hi, Brian," his wife replied. "How are you?" "So far, so good," he replied. "We just returned from shopping." "Is Tara with you?" "She's in the living room. I gave her an hour of time on the tablet." "Fine." There was silence. Brian thought he heard the wind blowing on Becky's phone. He guessed that she was somewhere on the street and asked, "How do you feel?" "I don't know," Becky said. "I fluctuate from one extreme state to another. Sometimes I just want to go home and get everything back to normal, but other times I want to tear our life apart." "It's clear." "Is it clear?" "I don't know, Becky," he said. "I honestly don't know." "You usually have an answer for everything, Brian." Not this time. There was another silence. Brian walked to the dining room door and closed it quietly. "I have a question I want to ask you," Becky said, "and I want you to give an honest answer." "Do you still trust my words?" Brian asked. "Yes, in a strange way, I trust." "Why?" "I do not know for sure. I just go with my instincts." "Will you give me your word, Brian?" "Certainly." "Yes, you have my word." "Fine." Brian heard his wife take a deep breath. "Since we've been together," Becky said, "how many times have you cheated on me?" "Once." "So, that time with Siobhan was the only one? In all our years together?" "Yes." "Do you swear?" "I swear." "To be clear," Becky said, "I'm giving you a chance to confess if there are any other skeletons in the closet." "I understand that," Brian said. "I also understand that if I hide something now and you find out later, then you and I will end. You will divorce me, right?" "Yes, faithfully." "Fine. I stand by my statement. Siobhan was the only time." There was silence on the line. Brian opened the door and listened to the sounds in the corridor. Tara laughed quietly at some game. Brian closed the door again and leaned against the doorframe. "Okay," Becky finally said. "I accept it." "Great." Brian stood listening, resisting the temptation to ask if she was coming home now. He really wanted to make love to her, and he held his breath, waiting for her answer. "Okay," she said finally, "I'm going to leave now. But can I call you in the evening?" "Certainly." "Fine. Say hi to Tara for me." "I'll pass it on." "Bye." "Bye, Becky." And Brian held the phone to his ear, waiting for her to end the call. Becky turned off her phone, put it in her pocket, and looked at the view in front of her. She was sitting on a bench under a tree, and in front of her were rows of old tombstones with dates of birth going back to the 1800s. But Becky's gaze went beyond the gravestones, to the old stone church that stood under a blue sky with white clouds, the same church in which she and Brian renewed their vows a few months ago. She looked just as Becky remembered her, rugged, strong, both impressive and modest. Maybe it was impressive that she had been standing there for so long. Be that as it may, the sight of this church consoled her. Becky would have preferred to sit inside, but the church was closed. There would be a service tomorrow morning after all. Tomorrow was Sunday, but Becky didn't want to go. She wanted to understand her understanding of God and not join a group of people who already had their own ideas about him. "How do you feel?" asked an inner voice. "I don't know," Becky answered herself. "Try again." "Okay, I feel a lot of things. Confusion and anger, joy and sadness. It pisses me off that the church is closed, but if it weren't, I wouldn't have called Brian, and it was nice to hear his voice. But the feeling of joy from talking to him also confuses me, because shouldn't I hate and despise the man who cheated on me? It's a mystery, isn't it?" Yes. Becky remembered last night and her conversation with Katie. They sat at the bar talking until 1 in the morning, and Becky was so happy to vent to the other woman. I must say, Katie was really interested in Becky's story. She and John had been together for just over a year, but had no plans to get married, and Katie wasn't sure if she believed in marriage. She was curious to know why Becky married Brian. "For starters," said Becky, "we just gave in to a romantic dream. We met, fell in love, and the dream isn't complete until you get married, right? That's how it works in movies." "Yes," Katie answered, "but don't you have to be a little naive to think that this is how it works in real life?" "I used to think so myself," Becky said. "But when it actually happens, when you meet a man who seems to understand you, and the conversations are great, and the sex is incredible, you start to think, maybe we'll be the ones to make that dream come true. Maybe we will be the exception to the rule." That sounds a little selfish. "Oh yeah, Brian and I have huge egos. Brian sees himself as a man of truth, and I act like I'm God's gift to men. Well, you're really tasty, you know." "Thank you. I'm serious. If I were a man, I would hook up with you." Becky laughed, her face flushed, and she blinked her glass with the other woman, accepting the compliment. But now, as Becky sat under the tree and recalled this moment, she began to wonder if there was something more beneath the surface. Katie was very straightforward and didn't seem to be the type to say things without meaning. Why didn't Becky notice this then? Because Katie was still asking questions, said an inner voice. Yes, that's right, Becky thought. Once Katie understood why Becky got married, she wanted to know why Becky stayed married. "Well, Tara, for one," Becky replied. "Okay, you have a baby," Katie said. "But what else?" "Well," and Becky went on to talk about her relationship with Brian, how they learned to communicate better, and how their love seemed to deepen as they accepted that neither of them would ever be perfect or even good people. But although Kathy was a good listener, she continued to press the question. "Yes, but what does this have to do with marriage?" Becky had a hard time answering this question. But as she sat brooding under a tree in the cemetery, Becky realized that she and Katie had barely talked about parenting. Moreover, it seemed natural, as if marriage were the main event and children were an additional element. And for some people it is. But when Becky thought about why she felt married to Brian, not just in a relationship or together or a couple, but married, the answer was always the same. This is because they decided to have a child together. And now that Tara was here, Becky couldn't cancel Brian. Oh, she could divorce him, throw him out of Tara's life, never see him again. But Brian would still be Tara's father. Becky could marry another man, force Tara to call him Daddy, and tell the world that the new man is the real father. And Brian would still be Tara's father. Becky could even attack the very concept of father, saying that it has no real meaning, and that women should be free to do whatever they want in any situation. And Brian would still be Tara's father. Tara's kinship was as immutable and immutable as the stones from which the old church was built. She was literally created from the DNA of her mother and father, And although the people who built this church did not know about DNA, they believed in the importance of blood ties. They would not ignore the topic of parenthood. In those days, starting a family with children was the main purpose of marriage. The happiness of a man and a woman with each other was secondary. Looking at the church, Becky realized that this was the root of her internal conflict. As a woman, she absolutely believed that she had the right, and perhaps even the obligation, to divorce Brian for cheating. But as a mother, did she have the right to throw her child's father out of the family? Well, if Brian was dangerous or a drunk, the answer would be clear. But he was neither one nor the other. He was a generally decent man and a wonderful father who once slept with another woman. Yes, he shouldn't have done that. And yes, he had to confess at some point before they renewed their vows. But does his inability to do so justify throwing him out of the family? Becky saw that her motherly side had a very clear answer to this question: no. And her feminine part was furious. If you had cheated, she shouted, he would have divorced you. I know, answered the maternal part. So why is it fair that you don't divorce him? I'm not trying to be fair to him. I try to be fair to my daughter. But this is unfair to me, the female part cried. My right to happiness, my right to be respected by my husband, my right to marriage equality. What would equality look like here? If Brian can sleep with another woman, I should have the right to sleep with another man. And Tara? This doesn't concern Tara. This concerns me. Yes, but... Becky groaned and leaned forward, holding her head in her hands. Her stomach was knotted, and the muscles in her neck and shoulders were tense. God, no wonder she felt torn inside with this fight in her head. The wind grew stronger, rustling the leaves of the tree. Becky stood up and stretched, raising her arms above her head. So much for peace and quiet. She started to walk back to the car, but then realized that her internal argument would resume as soon as she got in. So she walked past the car and headed towards the hills. It was about 6 o'clock in the evening when Becky returned to the Cocher and Horses Inn. She walked through the reception area where John was checking in another couple and went straight up to her room. She took a shower, then put on a dress and heels. Looking in the full-length mirror, she wondered if she looked too feminine. She didn't want to be too obvious, so she wore a short denim jacket to cover her shoulders. There was a second staircase leading to a hallway that led to the bar, but Becky wanted John to see her, so she went down the stairs that led to the reception area. She's lucky. John was alone at the counter. His eyes lit up when he saw her. Good evening, he said. You look amazing, if I may say so. Thank you. Are you going to have dinner at one of our wonderful restaurants? Actually, I was thinking of having dinner here. John's face became serious. Do you know that our canteen is only open for breakfast? He said. Yes, I know, Becky replied. But you have a menu in the bar, don't you? It is not very extensive. Beef and kidney pie, chicken and potatoes. Pub food, as they call it. This will suit me quite well. Becky leaned against the front desk and looked at him with open attraction. If John had any doubts about this woman wanting him, that look cleared them up. Without taking his eyes off her, he said, I understand that you and Katie had a good talk yesterday. Yes, we talked. Well, you might be interested to know that Kathy and I were discussing you this morning. Yes, and what about? One of the things that Katie and I agreed on, he said, was that you are, without a doubt, one of the most beautiful women to ever walk through these doors. Becky's throat tightened. She had to look down at the counter. Don't, she said. You will upset me. It was your husband who upset you, John said. And to be honest, Katie and I are not happy with it. Me too. Katie thinks he should be taught a lesson. Becky slowly raised her head until she met his gaze again. Which lesson? She asked. You know the expression, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. Yes, such a lesson. Becky looked at John's tie, mulling over his words. That's Katie's opinion, Becky said. What do you think? What do I think? Yes. John leaned over and whispered in her ear. I think I would like to get to know you better, he said. Becky felt her body respond to his words, and for a few electric moments she felt her breathing, her heartbeat. Then John let go of her hand and pulled away. "Go have dinner," he said. "I'm not hungry." Well, Becky stopped mid-sentence. But it's obvious that she and John knew what menu she was thinking about. He smiled and said, "Katie will be at the bar later. She wants to talk." "What's going on between you two?" Becky asked. "Let's just say she owes me." Becky frowned, wanting to know more. But the sounds of an approaching couple reached her ears, and she didn't want anyone to see her with another man. So she nodded to John and walked down the corridor towards the bar. It was about 9 in the evening. Brian had put Tara to bed and was now watching a movie in the living room. It was a movie he'd seen a dozen times, but as he waited for the phone to ring, he wasn't in the mood for anything new. However, he found it difficult to concentrate, and when the phone finally rang and he saw his wife's name on the screen, his dominant emotion was relief. "Hello," he said. "Hello, Brian. What's happened? Why do you think that? I hear it in your voice." There was silence. Brian turned off the TV and sat down. All his senses were on edge. "Where are you?" he asked. "In your room." "You are alone?" "Of course, alone. Why do you ask?" "Intuition. If I'm wrong, tell me. I'd like to be wrong about this." There was another silence, a silence that spoke more than 1,000 words. Brian felt his chest tighten, and he began to pace back and forth. "Come on," he said. "Let's do the worst." "I didn't do anything, Brian." "You haven't done anything yet." Again silence, full of meaning. Finally, Becky exploded. "Damn you, Brian, damn you. Look, if I'm wrong. Don't play games. You know very well that you are wrong." Brian sighed with some semblance of relief. He sat back down on the sofa and rested his head on his hand. I heard Becky clear her throat. "Do you want to say something, Brian?" "Yes," he said. "Please don't do this. You have no right to ask for this." "I do not claim my rights. I'm just asking. Please don't do this." "Brian, please don't do this, Becky." "Brian, this will happen whether you want it or not." Brian felt his entire chest cool. This was the moment he had always dreaded, and now it was happening. One of his deepest fears, being deceived by his wife, had become a reality, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He sat there trying to catch his breath. "Brian?" A voice came from the phone. "Brian, are you still there?" "Yes," Brian said quietly. "I'm still here. You brought this on yourself. Is it not?" "Yes, yes. You understand this, don't you?" "Not really, no." "Well, you will have enough time to understand it. I have to go. Becky." "Good night, Brian." And the phone went silent. Room number 3 at the Coach and Horses Inn used to be one of the cheap guest rooms with 3 beds, squeezed in into a cramped space with a low ceiling. Today, there was only a double bed against the back wall, but the space was still cramped by modern standards. Despite this, the current occupant used every inch of carpeting as she paced, turned, and waved her arms during a telephone conversation. Becky deeply regretted her decision to call her husband. She had already decided to sleep with John and was even excited about it. Ironically, the only reason she called Brian was because she had promised him this before and didn't want to raise suspicion. The plan was to ask about Tara, assure Brian that she loved him, and she did love him, and say goodnight. Becky could then get over her sexual escapade and return to her marriage feeling like she had restored balance. But that plan was now in tatters. Brian's intuition worked from the first minute of conversation, and he pulled the rug out from under her feet. Becky turned off the phone so he couldn't call back and looked at her reflection in the mirror. Part of her mind was screaming, "Come on, girl," and yet, seeing how beautiful she looked, she felt disgusting. Sleeping with John no longer seemed like a sexual adventure to her. It seemed like an act of revenge. Becky put the phone in her small purse, left the room, and headed towards the stairs. Katie had not yet appeared, and Becky hoped that she was already at the bar. Maybe, deep down, Becky hoped that Katie would change her mind so she wouldn't have to make a decision. It seemed terribly unfair to her that the fate of her marriage depended on her, although she herself insisted on it. The bar was as busy as expected on a Saturday night, and there were 2 bartenders behind the bar. No, 3. Katie looked elegant with her hair slicked back as she emerged from behind the counter with a couple bottles of liquor. Becky found a seat at one end of the bar, and within seconds, there was a gin and tonic in front of her. The service made her feel like a VIP. Becky sat sipping her drink and doing her best to avoid eye contact with the men staring at her. The last thing she wanted was for some stranger to hit on her. But she needn't have worried. After a short conversation with the staff, Katie walked up to the bar and plopped down next to Becky. She looked her straight in the eyes, and for a moment Becky thought the other woman kissed her. "Hello, beautiful," Katie said. "Hi," Becky replied. "You look fantastic. You know that, right?" "Thank you." Katie waved for Jake to bring her a drink. Then she leaned towards Becky. "So, here it is," Katie said. "On the other side of the stairs from your room, there's a door marked private. It leads to my apartment here in this building. John finishes at 10, so he'll be there in about a quarter of an hour. Just knock on the door." Becky took a long sip, the ice clinking in the glass. Katie smiled as Jake quietly placed the same glass in front of his boss, and then disappeared to serve another customer. Katie leaned against Becky so that their shoulders were touching. "Are you nervous?" Katie asked. "A little." "Everything will be fine. I probably won't finish work until after midnight, so you and John will have plenty of time to get to know each other better." "Why are you doing this, Katie?" "Not everyone believes in monogamy, Rebecca. You could even argue that we are naturally sexual beings, and trying to be monogamous is unnatural." "Are you saying that my husband did the right thing by sleeping with another woman?" "No, I'm not saying that. If a man makes a promise, he has to keep it. And if he doesn't keep his promise, why should you keep yours?" "Because I made my promise to God," Becky thought. But she didn't say it out loud. She didn't want Katie to think she was a religious fanatic. Katie leaned over and kissed Becky on the cheek. "I need to get back to work," she said. "But do what you want. Trust me, Rebecca. I want this to happen as much as you do." Katie jumped out of her chair and downed her drink in one gulp. She then smiled at Becky and went back behind the counter. Becky watched the other woman with admiration. She absolutely owned the place, like a queen with two bartenders who clearly adored her. Becky had never been with another woman before, had never even been interested in it, and yet now she couldn't get the thought out of her head. Becky gulped down her gin and tonic. Her face was bright red, and she had a terrible feeling that everyone in the bar could tell she was worried. It was too much. Becky stood up from her chair, waved goodbye to her mistress, and headed back to her room. There was still half an hour until 10:15, and Becky wanted to be ready when she knocked on that door. Brian stood in the living room. He felt calm. There was the sound of crying, but it didn't come from him. It was Tara who was crying. She cried for her mother. Brian looked around in a kind of daze. The entire room was smashed and destroyed. Shelves lay on the floor, there were books and CDs everywhere. There were holes in the walls from torn-off bolts. Everything china and glass was in pieces, and all the curtains were torn off along with the curtain rods and lay in large piles. Brian looked in amazement at the flat screen he had somehow managed to bend in half, tearing it screaming out of its wall mount. "How the hell did I do this?" he thought. Brian took a few slow breaths. He was familiar with the phrase, "go into a rage," but always considered it a figurative expression. Now he knew better. From the moment he threw his smartphone at the picture of Becky's yacht and began his whirlwind of destruction, he realized that rage truly was a force in itself, as all-consuming as love or fear, and it was okay, somehow. Brian looked at the destruction around him and felt it was appropriate. Tara's crying intensified. She might start choking if she wasn't careful. Brian headed for the door, his feet crunching through shards of glass and plastic. He turned off the light and carefully closed the door, then quickly ran upstairs and into the child's room. Tara sat in bed, her face a wet mask of grief and fear. She held out her arms the moment Brian entered the room, and he gathered her up and held her. She was scared by the monster that was screaming and crashing downstairs, and Brian consoled the child without telling her that the monster was him. "I want Mom! I want Mom!" She's screaming take. I know, Tara. I know. Brian sat on the girl's bed and held her while she cried. She called for her mother over and over again, and her father said, I know, without promising or denying, just holding her and letting her cry as long as she needed to. As Tara began to calm down and the crying turned to sobbing, Brian thought, so this is what it feels like when your family falls apart. This surprised him. Movies always show couples having dramatic arguments before breaking up, but as Brian held his little girl, he realized that this was completely wrong. The end of their marriage wasn't caused by Becky's anger and rage or her angry words. It was her absence, that she wasn't here. This was the fatal blow. When will Mommy come home? Tara sobbed. Tomorrow, said Brian. At what time? I don't know, he sighed. Honestly, I do not know. In room 3, Becky sat barefoot on the bed, waiting for time to pass. It dragged on painfully slowly. There was no clock in the room, so she turned on the phone, afraid to see a message or missed call from her husband. There was nothing. The time showed that the wait was less than 15 minutes, and there were no other notifications. I knew Brian had too much pride to call back, she thought. He'll be fine. Who are you kidding? Said the inner voice. It's killing him. Becky's chest felt like it was squeezing from the inside. It occurred to her that she had not heard her inner voice since she sat on the bench outside the church. Of course not, said an inner voice. My job is to tell you the truth, and that's the last thing you want to hear right now. He started it, Becky said to herself. It's entirely his fault. I'm not here to assign blame, said an inner voice. I'm simply reminding you of what you already know, that the choices you make tonight will determine the kind of woman you will be in the years to come. Why does that have to be a choice? Why can't I be Brian's wife and have an adventure? He did. Are you trying to pretend that a choice isn't a choice? Said the inner voice. I thought you despised people who did that. He made me do it. It is not my fault, or best of all, I have a right to this. Becky bit her lip, tears streaming down her face. The inner voice continued mercilessly. Let you have a sexual adventure if you want, she said. But don't kid yourself that it has anything to do with Brian. How can you say that? It has everything to do with him. Only in the sense that you're trying to make Brian responsible for his actions. But he is responsible. How? If he hadn't cheated, I wouldn't have done this. This lie was so obvious that even the inner voice seemed to be at a loss for words. Becky felt the wave of self-indulgence. She felt sick, almost nauseous. Memories about dancing with Marcus DeVere and how it turned her on popped into her head. Is this Brian's fault too? Yes, said the hoarse voice in Becky's head. If Brian was a true alpha male, you wouldn't be interested in Marcus. Becky clutched her head, horrified by how part of her mind seemed dedicated to turning everything around so that she would never be at fault for anything. God, I'm such a wreck, she said out loud. You are a man, said an inner voice. Believe it or not, what you're going through is normal. Is it true? Certainly. Becky leaned on her elbows and stared at the floral curtains. The phone on the bed showed the time, 10:15. What should I do? Becky said to herself. Decide what kind of woman you want to be, said an inner voice, and then make decisions based on that. Where to begin? Last night you toasted to finding the true meaning of strength. Were you serious about that, or were you just trying to impress Katie? No, I'm serious. Then start there. Decide that you want to be a strong woman, in the best sense of the word. A woman filled with love, a woman with honor, the kind of woman you want your daughter to become. Okay, Becky said. Fine. Now ask yourself, said the inner voice. If you were already this woman, if she were sitting in this room right now, what would she do? Becky didn't even have to think about it. The answer came instantly, and she didn't like this answer. Crap, she said. It was night on an endless ocean that looked black in the darkness. Brian stood on the deck of a single-masted ship, looked at the horizon, and listened to the water splashing against the sides. He held on to the metal cable as the boat rocked slightly from side to side, and all was quiet. Quiet as in the grave. "Wake up, Brian," he said to himself. "Come on, wake up." The wind got stronger. Brian felt it on his forehead and ruffled his hair. Then, looking ahead, he saw the source of this wind. Huge wave extended across the entire ocean from horizon to horizon, heading towards him. It approached slowly, inexorably, like a giant mountain range, absolutely inevitable. Brian tried to close his eyes, but couldn't. He just stood there and watched as this giant wall of water came closer and closer until it blocked out the sky, and he could see the surface of the water, rising almost vertically in front of him. Brian screamed and shook. His eyes were closed, but he could see yellow light through his eyelids. He felt someone's fingers pressing on his arm and head. "Brian, it's me," said a female voice. Brian opened his eyes. For a moment, he thought he was still dreaming. Becky's face, her beautiful, beautiful face, was only a few centimeters from his, looking at him with a look. God, how can I describe that look? It was the same look that every man wants to see in the eyes of the woman he loves. Recognition, fun, and deep, deep joy, as if the woman was immensely happy to see him. His brain tried to catch up with what he was seeing, but it was sleepy and slow. The woman smiled, pursed her lips, and blew gently on his forehead. The flow of air made the hair on his forehead dance and flutter. "Becky," Brian finally said. "Yes, it's me." "But—" "No buts, Brian. Nothing happened. I'm still your wife, in every sense of the word." Brian's eyes filled with tears as his slow brain processed her words. He felt overwhelmed with emotion, almost suffocated with happiness. Unable to speak, he put his arm around Becky and held her close. The woman lay half on top of the man, stroking his arm with her thumb as he held her tightly. Several minutes passed as Brian held his wife, feeling like he was going to die of happiness. "I love you so much, Becky," he said. "I love you so much." "I know," Becky said. "I never doubted it for a second. Even when I was at my absolute lowest point, you still managed to love me. Sometimes I don't know how you do it. Loving you is easy," Brian said. "Trusting you is where the difficulty lies." "Yes." Becky sat up and looked at her man. She smiled and her eyebrows were raised in ironic agreement. Brian returned her gaze without a hint of irony. He was too happy that she was back. Becky saw this, and her eyebrows relaxed. She lowered her eyes and nodded. "I don't blame you for not trusting me," she said. "I don't trust myself half the time. I feel like Jekyll and Hyde." "What do you mean?" "When I drove home that night," Becky said, "I was having a huge fight with myself. Part of me knew I was doing the right thing, but the other part was so against it, so angry, so absolutely furious. The thing is that if a man does something, then a woman should be able to do it too. And by choosing to remain faithful when you didn't, it was like I was betraying myself. You know what I mean?" "I think so," Brian said. "You gave up something when I didn't, and Mr. Hyde thinks that's unfair." "Well, that's really unfair. There are no two ways about it, and it's very hard to argue with someone when you actually see their point of view." "Yes, it's true." Becky sighed and leaned her elbows on Brian's chest. She looked at the bedside lamp and her gaze became distant. "Anyway, after a 2-hour drive, I finally arrived home," she said. "I tried to call you from the car, but you weren't answering, and I was worried that you might have taken Tara and gone to your parents or something. But your car was still in the driveway, and I thought, okay, he's still at home. At this point, I was still mad at you and hoped that you would be happy to see me so that I could make you regret it. I had some really cool insults at the ready. But when I got out of the car, I noticed that there were no curtains in the living room. At first, I thought you forgot to close them, but no. The windows were like black, gaping holes. So I walked into the house with my suitcase, hung up my coat, and then opened the living room door and turned on the light." Becky fell silent. Looking at the bedside lamp, her eyes filled with tears. They flowed, dripping onto Brian's chest, and she roughly wiped her face with her forearm. She looked down at Brian, leaned in until she was close to kissing him, and stroked his forehead with her fingertips. When she spoke, it was in a whisper. "Brian," she said, "I had no idea how much it would hurt you if I slept with another man. I had no idea. Okay, I knew it would make you angry and angered, but not like that. Not to that extent, and I'm very, very sorry." Becky. "No, let me finish. I can't honestly say that I've forgiven you, and I don't know what to do about it. But this damn game I played, it makes me sick. I can't believe that I did, and wanting to have my own adventure suddenly seems like a huge miss of the point. I don't even know what the point is, but I know I missed it." "Yes," said Brian. "Yeah, that makes sense. Oh God, Brian, why do we do this to each other? Why do we always end up torturing each other when we love each other so much?" "I don't know," Brian said, his voice shaking. "I don't know." Both the man and woman burst into tears. They hugged tightly, sobbing, spurring each other, arms clasped around each other's bodies, as if demons were going to burst in and tear them apart. In the morning, Tara was overjoyed when she walked into the bedroom and saw her mother. Becky tried to sit up as her daughter bounced on her, chattering about all the things she and Daddy did and superhero girls and 100 other things kids talk about. It took a good 10 minutes to calm her down. Brian made sure the door to the living room was firmly closed before Tara was allowed downstairs. The three of them had breakfast together in the kitchen dining room. Mother and daughter chatted, and the man sat quietly in the background. When they finished eating, Tara wanted to show her mom something on the tablet. Becky looked at her husband. "Isn't he in the living room?" she asked. "Yes," said Brian. "I'll get it now." "Is he safe?" "Yes, it seems so." Brian stood up and left the room. He returned a few minutes later, and Tara climbed into her mom's lap as he handed her the tablet. Becky saw that there was not a scratch on him. Tara busied herself turning it on, and we drummed across the screen, telling her mom that she had something really cool that she wanted to show, but Becky was looking at Brian. He literally destroyed everything in this room, she thought. Why not a tablet? "Because he belonged to Tara," said an inner voice. Becky felt a lump form in her throat. She watched her husband pour himself another glass of orange juice and was surprised to realize that his capacity for violence did not frighten her. On the contrary, it calms her down. This man would fight for his family to his last breath if he had to. Becky wondered what John would do for Katie. "Mom, you're not looking." "Sorry, honey." Tara was holding a tablet. Becky snapped out of her thoughts and paid attention to what her daughter wanted to show her. But she felt impatient to be alone with her husband and then suggested that everyone get dressed and go to the park. There was a playground there which could keep Tara occupied while she and Brian could sit on the bench together and talk. It was cloudy outside, but not too cold, and the three of them went to the park. They walked along a path through an avenue of trees, along with other families and runners. Tara walked between her parents, holding their hands, and asked them to lift her and rock her, so Brian turned off the path onto the grass. Two adults walked, swinging a screaming, laughing little girl in the air. Becky noticed another couple doing the same thing to the little boy, but she and Brian were much more coordinated, lifting Tara almost horizontally, her legs flying into the air as she lifted. They truly were a great team, and Becky was horrified at how close she came to losing it all. As the playground came into view, Tara squealed and ran forward. Becky and Brian followed her, holding each other's hands, walking through the small gate and sitting down on one of the benches. Tara was already on the miniature castle, crossing the bridge to the slide. "Mom, look!" she shouted, and Becky waved to her, then took Brian's hand and leaned on him. "I love you, Brian," she said. "I'm glad to hear that," he replied, squeezing her thigh with his large hand. "And I'm really glad you came home last night." "Me too. It was a good decision." They sat for a while, enjoying each other and watching their daughter. Becky then said, "Can I ask you a question, Brian?" "Certainly. If a man with a machete ran out of the forest, would you risk your life to protect me?" "Of course I would risk it. God, what a question." You are sure? Becky, who would I be if I didn't do this? Okay, Becky said, but what if I slept with another man? Would you still risk your life for me? Becky felt the muscles in her husband's arm tense. He fell silent. When he finally spoke, there was a hard edge to his voice. I probably would, Brian said, but I'd be angry. I'd think, this isn't my job anymore. It should be that other guy risking his life. That's what I thought, Becky said. Do you want to tell me something? No, I'm just trying to understand the situation, Becky said. It's clear to me that the best thing for our marriage is for me to remain faithful to you. But for this to work, I need to let go of the fact that you weren't faithful to me, and that still irks Brian. It still pisses me off. And if I don't find a way to let this go, this will poison our relationship. Becky is still leaning her elbows on her husband's hand, absent-mindedly watching Tara, who was riding a horse on a huge metal spring. She felt Brian move. He put his arm around her shoulders and kissed the top of her head. I'm sorry I put you in this situation, he said. Thank you. I appreciate you saying that. Is there something I can do? Oh yes, said Becky. There definitely is. It was the first time they had made love since everything had come to light, and part of the miracle for Brian was that Becky had initiated it. As they walked home from the park as a family, Brian suggested that Becky take Tara somewhere while he cleaned the living room. Becky shook her head, saying that the mess was as much her fault as it was his, and she wanted them to clean up together. This touched Brian deeply, and when Becky called her best friend Tara's parents to see if she could spend the day with them, he suggested they spend the time cleaning up the mess. But when Becky returned home after dropping Tara off, she pounced on him, kissing him passionately, and they immediately went upstairs and had sex. I am your slave. Really? You'll do whatever I want? Yes. Good, then. Becky put her mouth to Brian's ear and said, Tell me what happened. Brian froze. Brian cleared his throat. I already told you what happened. Just the basic story, Becky said in his ear. I want the full story. I want the details. I want to know what you said, what you did, and how you felt when you did it. I want to know everything. Brian swallowed. He remembered his night. He felt Becky exhale in triumph. Oh God, she said, you want to tell me. Brian was silent. He felt Becky take his head in her cool hands and turn him so that they were looking into each other's eyes. Her eyes were wide open and sparkling, full of curiosity. Brian thought she had never looked sexier or more beautiful. He loved her so much. She looked at him and smiled. You want it, don't you? She pushed. Yes. Then tell me everything. Brian looked into Becky's eyes and began his story. But this was not the story he expected to tell. Whenever he imagined telling his wife about his infidelity, he always began with a preamble about how hurt he was, how depressed he was over the loss of his business, and how he honestly believed that at the time their marriage to Becky was headed for divorce. But as true as it all was, it seemed like the wrong story when Becky was so loving, so sexy, so open. So he began to tell her another story, although equally true, about the woman who had been a colleague and friend for 5 years of his life, about a woman whom he respected and liked very much, about a woman who attracted him, although he always thought that nothing would happen. But when events turned out such that they found themselves alone in an empty office at night, he realized that he wanted her. He wanted to stay married, and he wanted sex with her. It seemed like a dream come true. Is it true? Becky said. So you've already had fantasies about sleeping with her? Yeah, Brian said. Not so much after I met you, but when I first started working with her. God, yes. And she wasn't interested? No, she had a rule not to date her colleagues. Said Becky. I'm always skeptical of people who say that, especially since she slept with you anyway. Well, technically we weren't colleagues anymore. Yeah, but I'm sure she would have slept with you before. I bet she wanted to sleep with you after you started dating me. You might be right. Why do you think so? Brian took a deep breath. Well, he said, if I was already risking my marriage, I might as well take full advantage of it. You bastard, Becky said, laughing. Oh my God, I married a monster. I'm afraid so. So, what happened? Well, she asked me if I was going to tell my wife I cheated. I said no, and she said, too bad. I'd like to see her face when she finds out. Bitch. Yeah, she wasn't a fan of yours. Don't tell me that. I understood that perfectly well at the airport. Are you okay? He asked. Yes, okay, she said. And I shouldn't feel good, right? I don't know. Brian, come on. You're telling me about the woman you cheated with, and it was obviously more than just sex. And it seems strangely normal. I understand why you did it, and I don't feel the least bit threatened. In fact, if you hadn't done this, I wouldn't have thought, oh, my husband is so faithful. What a hero, I would think. Lord, he had the opportunity to sleep, and he chickened out. Becky, what do you want to say? I don't know what I want to say. This is new territory for me. I know what I have to say. Since you cheated, I have to send you to the guest room and make you humiliate yourself to earn forgiveness. But I don't want that. I want to find another solution. What solution? Becky looked at him with ironically raised eyebrows. Brian, don't pretend, she said. You know exactly where this is going. I wish you would say it straight. Okay, I'll tell you, Becky said. I'm not mad at you for cheating because she's a really attractive woman and you're a red-blooded man. I'm mad at you for sleeping with her and not letting me sleep with Marcus. DeVere, and now I had to say no to a second opportunity and I'm angry, Brian. I thought you didn't want to play tit for tat. But it wouldn't be tit for tat if you agreed. You could even argue that we are naturally sexual beings and that monogamy is unnatural. God, Becky, do you really want to sleep with another man that bad? I want what you got with her. It was clearly more than just sex, and if I can take it for you, why can't you take it for me? Brian didn't have an answer to that, but his body reacted. It seemed as if the nerve had been cut. For a moment he just stared, stunned, but gradually he began to understand what his body was telling him and the price he would pay if he ever said yes to Becky's proposal. He looked at Becky and saw from her expression that she had come to the same realization. And she didn't like it. Well, said Brian, so here he is, a red-blooded man. You bastard! Becky, do you seriously think I can control this? Tears of rage appeared in Becky's eyes. This is so unfair, she screamed. So unfair. She jumped out of bed and ran out of the room naked. Brian heard the bathroom door slam and lock, then heard his wife burst into tears of anger and frustration. Brian put on a sweatshirt and sweatpants, put on a pair of boat shoes, and headed downstairs. He took a roll of heavy-duty plastic garbage bags from the cupboard under the stairs and took it with him into the living room. The vandalized room looked exactly as he had left it, although in daylight it looked less dramatic, less the expression of a broken heart, and more like several hours of cleaning and renovation. He took a deep breath, then tore the bag from the roll and opened it. He began collecting shards of glass and porcelain. He had made some progress in cleaning the carpet when the door swung open and Becky stood on the threshold. She was also wearing sweatpants, but with a t-shirt and a pastel orange cardigan. She was wearing pink and white sneakers and had her hair pulled back into a ponytail, making her look like an overgrown teenager. She pouted. Hi, Brian said. I'm talking to the Dr. Jekyll or Mr. Hyde. Go to hell. Brian smiled and said to himself, Mr. Hyde. You think you're so smart, huh? Becky, I don't know what to do with you. 1 minute you're telling me that fidelity is the best thing for our marriage. The next minute you're trying to talk me into letting you take a lover. I'm not asking for a lover, I just want what you got. Brian stopped his work. He left the plastic bag on the floor and walked over to Becky. She hugged herself like she always did when she felt insecure. He gently placed his hands on her shoulders and guided her towards the sofa. They sat next to each other and Brian took her hands and held them, looking into her eyes. Let me tell you what I got, Brian said. I got one evening of wonderful sex with a woman I always respected, and then I got a secret that I had to keep for years and years. And years, it was like having a rat living under the floor. Sometimes she was quiet and I forgot about her. But other times I heard her scratching or running along the ceiling, trying to find a way out. These were not the best moments, Becky. I mentally went around the whole house, checking that all the holes were closed. Brian took a deep breath. And then I got caught, he said. You met her by chance, and the secret was out. The rat was now in the house, and God, what chaos she caused. Yes, I see it. I'm not talking about the room, Becky. Breaking that room was purely a reaction to the idea of you sleeping with another man. But that wasn't the worst part. Oh my God, what was the worst thing? The worst thing was standing in the cafe at my work while you told me you wanted to leaven, he said. And there was no anger, no condemnation, no sarcasm in your voice. Just some black emptiness of indifference. And at that moment I thought I had lost you. I saw my whole life slipping away from under my feet, and I knew it was my fault. Brian fell silent. Then he felt Becky let go of his hands and sit on his lap, wrapping her arms around his neck and kissing him. He hugged her tightly and then allowed the woman to get comfortable, pressing her cheek against his and feeling great relief and gratitude. Dr. Jekyll is back. I heard you, Brian, she said softly. I heard you completely. You're saying that if I want what you had, I need to do it on the same terms and take the same risks. And live with a rat under the floor. Oh yes, with a rat. But listen, Becky, I want to say something about this adventure you want. Becky sat down so they could look each other in the face. Her eyes sparkled and her expression was playful, mischievous. Speak, she said. Look, I cheated on you and got caught, Brian said. And you have to pay a price for getting caught. And I think that if you want to continue to torment me with requests to sleep with another man for the rest of our married life, then maybe I deserve it. In fact, I know a lot of people who would consider it a light punishment. Oh, Brian, I don't want to be the woman who tortures you. I want to be the woman who loves you. Yes, I know, but... Brian, don't you understand? I have a feeling that because you cheated on me, you no longer deserve my love. That a man who cheats loses the right to the love of his woman. So, to move forward, I have to say fuck this feeling and choose to love you no matter what. But do you have any idea how hard that is? Brian looked at Becky's pained yet beautiful face and wondered how he could ever see this woman as an outgrown teenager. She could be so clear sometimes, so tuned and precise. At times like these, he not only loved Becky, but also felt a deep respect for her, a respect completely different from the usual respect that men are trained to show women so as not to be accused of sexism. No, it was real. Respect born of the knowledge that he was not the only smart person in the room, that he was dealing with a woman who could see right through him, and who was capable of almost brutal honesty with herself, more than any other woman he had known, and often more than himself. Brian looked at the woman in his lap and felt awe. Becky, he said, I want to apologize. You already apologized. I'm not talking about her. I want to apologize for constantly and incessantly underestimating you. Becky's eyes immediately filled with tears. She looked at her husband and said, Continue. It is very clear to me, Becky, that if the situation had been reversed, I could not have handled this with even a fraction of the grace and courage that you are now displaying. In fact, you can see from this room how I would have handled it. With your betrayal, I would have pressed the self-destruct button on our marriage, and that would have been it. Brian put his arm around Becky and held her. But what did you do? He said. You took it upon yourself. You kept it a secret. You made room for yourself to decide what to do. Now, I don't know what happened while you were away, but I see that I assumed you were going to punish me or chase some cheap sex to get back at me. I also see that I have a tendency to think that I am the one who is taking this marriage seriously, while you are only in it for what you can get out of it. Get it? But if it were true, you wouldn't come home at 1 in the morning. You wouldn't have insisted on making love, even though you were still mad at me, and we wouldn't have these conversations. And I'm so sorry that I looked down on you and patronized you and thought of myself as the smarter one in the marriage. I'm an idiot, Becky. Damn you, idiot. Becky cried in his arms. Brian didn't sob, but tears streamed down his face as he held her. He felt so lucky to have Becky as his wife, with a depth that was new to him. Yes, she was Jekyll and Hyde, but who wasn't? And Jekyll's part had much more merit than he gave it credit for. As for Mr. Hyde, well, he could find ways to deal with it. She was worth it. Becky checked the arrivals board at the airport terminal where she was to meet her parents. Their plane had just landed, but they still had to go through passport control and wait for their luggage. Becky thought she had at least half an hour. It was late in the evening and the huge windows looked out into the darkness of the night. As if to compensate, the airport's interior was bright and garish, with illuminated signs on top of real lights. Becky walked towards the arrivals area where her parents were about to get off and looked around for a place to sit. There was a coffee shop overlooking large sliding doors through which passengers with luggage carts exited. Becky stood in line, bought herself a latte this time in a glass mug, and sat down at one of the cafe's small tables. She felt good. In fact, she felt great. Sipping her latte, Becky looked around, hoping to see a woman in a raincoat with cherry red hair. Honestly, this woman looked much better as a blonde. If she showed up now, Becky could tell her every detail of her evening with her husband. How interesting, Becky thought. She still wanted Brian to be reliable, but she didn't want him to be tamed. She remembered watching a dog training program on TV. On the screen was a gorgeous German shepherd with a piece of raw meat dangling in front of him, while his obnoxious owner bragged that the dog would starve for hours without touching the meat until he got the signal. Becky found it sad, even pathetic. A healthy dog had to jump on a piece of raw meat, and the red-blooded man had to jump on the woman. Even if he said no, Becky considered it unnatural if the man did not at least want it. That was the problem. Becky sympathized with Katie's point that wanting sex with other people was normal and perhaps even healthy. But she also agreed with Brian that if they did start having sex with other people, they would lose the very intimacy that made their marriage worthwhile. It was necessary to choose. This still made Becky angry. She had such a character that she wanted to have both. But as time went on, she began to blame Brian less and more to blame reality for being the way it was. After all, it was not men's fault that life was unfair, although Becky knew very few women who shared this view. Her phone screeched. It was a message from Becky's mother, informing her that she and her father were standing at the baggage conveyor, waiting for it to start. Becky finished her latte and looked out at the crowd of people waiting for their loved ones, some holding signs or balls. She thought she could enjoy her place for a few more minutes. Her thoughts went back to the Coach and Horses Inn. Becky knew she would never see this place again. Or maybe in 20 years, she and Brian would drive past him on their way somewhere else, and she would tell him the story. She hated that Brian didn't want to know anything about her time there. After Becky listened to him tell his story, it hit a button that said, "If I can do it for you, why can't you do it for me?" However, there were a lot of things Brian did that she didn't want to do, so she might have to live with it for a while. But going back to that weekend, Becky ended up knocking on the door marked private a little after 10:30. John opened the door and saw the sexy woman from room 3 in a coat and boots with a travel suitcase next to her. Always a gentleman, he didn't try to change her mind, but went down to the front desk to check her out and even offered to refund her money for one night. Becky flatly refused. "I feel bad enough about this," she said. "Well, don't," said John. "I respect your decision, and I think your husband is very, very lucky. Thanks, but I'm going to give him hell when I get home. I bet he'd rather have hell from you than heaven from any other woman." This touched Becky. Damn, it still touched her, making her eyes sparkle as she sat in the airport coffee shop. She thanked John again, asked him to say goodbye to Kathy, and left the hotel, getting into her car and driving out of the old stable yard onto the road for the long drive home. But as Becky thought about that decision, She realized that her regrets didn't include the sex she didn't have with John. They were about the intimacy she could share with Katie. Becky checked her phone. It was time to join the crowd of waiting people. Sliding doors now opened regularly, releasing passengers with luggage carts and tans. Becky found a place out of the way, some distance from the noisier people. There were shouts of joy and hugs, many small reunions. Becky crossed her arms and began tapping her foot, waiting. "Dad!" cried the little girl, running towards the side where Becky stood. The girl was tied up with a couple standing nearby, and the man walked forward to catch the child in his arms. Becky wondered why the child's mother remained where she was, and then realized that it was not the child's mother. No, it should be a tired woman pushing a luggage cart loaded with bags, with a boy of about 10 walking next to her. He looked at his father's friend with obvious hostility and said to his mother, in a voice loud enough for Becky to hear, "What is she doing here?" Becky tried to look at the sliding doors and ignore the scene unfolding a few meters to the side. It was more like a prisoner exchange from a Cold War spy movie. It sounded terrible, especially when the boy started crying. Becky looked up at the ceiling and sent a silent prayer of gratitude. "Keep something for yourself," said an inner voice. "Even the best advice is useless if it is not listened to." Becky sighed deeply with happiness and turned her attention back to the large sliding doors. They've reopened, and here they are. Mom and Dad finally came out. Both of her parents were tanned, which contrasted sharply with their silver hair. Otherwise, Becky's father looked much the same as when he left, with the same neutral frown on his face, pushing the luggage cart with serious stoicism. But Becky's mom looked transformed. She was wearing a colorful Hawaiian blouse that should have looked kitschy, but didn't. She looked joyful, enthusiastic, and Becky's mom looked 10 years younger. When she saw her daughter, she smiled and waved in a way that reminded Becky of Tara. Her father pushed the cart past the end of the barrier, and Becky hugged them both. "How are you traveling?" she asked. "Fantastic," exclaimed her mother. "Oh, Becky, you can't imagine that." Can we talk in the car?" her father interrupted. "Of course, dear," said his wife and turned to Becky. "Your father doesn't share my enthusiasm for adventure." "I had quite a good time," the old man defended himself. "But I'm also looking forward to coming home." "Okay, give me a minute." Becky's mom took her daughter's hands and looked into her eyes. "How are you, Becky?" she asked. "I'm doing great, Mom." "Really? You look radiant." "Is it true?" "Yes." "Did something happen while we were away?" Becky laughed and kissed her mother's hands. She looked at the older woman and said, "Mom, life happened." She let go of her mother's hands and hugged her father's shoulders. "Come on, let's take you home," Becky said. Her father nodded gratefully. Soon the three of them were heading through the arrivals hall, the old man pushing a cart and his wife chatting, while her adult daughter walked alongside, dragging his mother's suitcase across the shiny floor.